Okay, so today we are going to finish the book of Galatians. We left off halfway through chapter 2. I wanted to do all of Galatians in one day, but since I had already done several videos of pretty intense preparation work as we set the table for the letters of Paul, not just Galatians, but the letters of Paul in general, I got to a point where I just couldn't continue. My voice was going to give out if I had spoken any longer, and I knew that I had a good 2 or 3 30-minute videos left to get through this book, and I had already done 3 or 4 such videos, and I had my brother coming over later in the evening, and we were going to be together talking and chatting all night. So I knew, I just got to wave the white flag and say, even though I wanted to get all of Galatians done in one day, I just couldn't. Now, it won't matter to you. Anybody watching this video in years to come, it won't matter. But to me, we're doing these in time, November 13th and 14th, 2024. I wanted to get Galatians done in one day, but I just couldn't quite do it. Anyway, we are halfway through Galatians chapter 2. Up to this point in the book of Galatians, Paul has been defending his own apostleship, apparently because the people who were causing trouble in Galatia were discrediting him. They were saying stuff like, he's not really an apostle, he's not, he was not one of the original 12. He, got the message wrong. The things he taught you when he came through here a few years ago or a year or two ago are not quite accurate. You need to become Jews. You Gentile Christians. These were Gentile churches. You need to get circumcised and start following the Torah in order to really become Christians. And Paul was just a little off. He didn't tell you about all that because he doesn't quite know what he's talking about. He's not really an apostle. So Paul had to defend himself, and he went through this sequencing where he got his gospel from. It was a revelation given him straight from Jesus. He did not get it from Peter or James or any other apostles. He did not even really consult with them. When he got his commission to be an apostle, he went to Arabia for some quiet reflection, apparently. And then he went to Damascus, stayed there. Then he did go to Jerusalem, but he didn't become a member of the inner circle. And he was chased out of there and went back home and stayed there for about 10 years. Then he went to Antioch, and he was there with Barnabas. We read about this in Acts. And then he went on his mission. And he finally went, and then he went on to Jerusalem. He also went back to Jerusalem and did meet the apostles then, before he and Barnabas went on their mission. And so he's saying, I got my gospel straight from Jesus, and it's the correct gospel. It's completely trustworthy. And when I did finally consult with the other apostles, they weren't saying anything that I wasn't saying, and they had no disagreements with what I was saying, and we agreed to go to separate mission fields. They were going to stay in Jerusalem and work on the Jews down there, and I was going to go into the Gentile territories, and that was a mutual agreement, and we extended the right hand of fellowship to each other. But now he's going to talk about, he's going to start shifting. So he's laid the groundwork. He has set up his defense of his apostleship. And now he is going to turn his attention to the issue in Galatia, now that he has defended himself against whatever the false teachers there were saying to discredit him. He is going to start turning his attention back to Galatia, the Galatia problem. And he's going to do this in the second half of what we call chapter 2. By relating an encounter he had with Peter at some point after Peter had arrived at Antioch while Paul was there. We don't know exactly when this happened. It could have happened not long after Acts 12. Remember, Acts 12 ends with Peter leaving the city of Jerusalem. We don't know where he goes. He could have gone to Antioch, or he ended up there eventually at least. And then Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch. So sometime after that, they're all in Antioch together, and Peter is there. I don't know how long he's there for. But a problem occurs, that a controversy arises that causes trouble in Antioch, and Paul has to confront Peter to settle this controversy. And he's going to use this incident where he deals with a problem that centered on Peter in Antioch to shift his focus from defending his apostleship to confronting the problem in Galatia. So this is somewhat of a transition section here. This is one of those places in Scripture, and there are not many places like this, but I mentioned before how in the original text there were no punctuation marks. And this is one of those, and this generally is not a problem. So we don't have periods, commas, quotation marks, things like that. And this generally is not a problem when we translate it into English, but there are a few instances where it does become a bit of an issue, because primarily it's usually because we don't really know sometimes where a quotation ends, because they didn't have quotation marks in their original language, and so they couldn't denote the end of a quotation by just putting period quotation marks like we can. And so there are a handful of, we saw one in the Epistle of James. We read the book of James, James 2. And we saw, there are instances where, in these epistles, in this case, in the Epistle of James, James is saying something about works and faith that he knows someone in his audience is going to object to. So he raises this person's objection. He knows that someone is going to have an argument. So he raises up this objector in his argument and puts this argument in the objector's mouth. And then he responds to that argument. But because there are no quotation marks and there's no other character in the narrative actually speaking, it can be a little difficult to tell exactly where the quotation that James is putting into the mouth of this anticipated objector ends and where James's rebuttal to that argument begins. It's a little hard to tell. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 3, there's a couple of places where it's hard to tell where the speaker is done speaking, the speaker in the narrative. In the first case is Jesus, and then later it's John the Baptist. It can be difficult to tell where that character is supposed to be done speaking, and then the author of the book takes over and starts summarizing. It happens back to back in John chapter 3. Once with Jesus speaking to Nicodemus, and once with John the Baptist talking to some people who come to question who he is and what he's doing, and whether or not it's a good thing for Jesus to become better than him or greater than him. And in both cases, in James, Jesus, and John, they just kind of keep on speaking, and you're not really sure, like, if they're still speaking or if the author of the book has taken over and is now summarizing his message. Not really a big deal. In this case, we have an issue where Paul is going to be relating an event that occurred in an argument that he had with Peter, and he is going to be quoting himself from what he said during this argument. And he's going to be using this argument as a way to turn his attention from what he had been talking about, defending his own apostleship, to his next point, which is setting the Galatians straight from the false teaching that they're succumbing to. And this section here, which we call the second half of chapter 2, is a transition here. And to bridge that gap, he's going to be talking about this incident, which already happened. It's a done event. Something that happened some time ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, I'm not really sure, when Peter and Paul have an argument in Antioch, and Paul is going to be quoting himself about what he said to Peter. And it's a little unclear when Paul is done quoting himself, from the time he confronted Peter, and when he starts talking back to the Galatians again. He certainly is talking to them by the beginning of chapter 3, because chapter 3:1 begins, "You foolish Galatians," so he's certainly talking to them by then. But because we don't have a period quotation mark in the ancient Greek, the quotation begins in chapter 2, verse 4, halfway through verse 14, where he says, "I said to them, Peter," in front of them all. And so the quotation begins there. But it's a little unclear when, from there to the end of the chapter, the quotation ends. And different people have different interpretations on that. So I'm going to be talking through this, and we're going to be trying our best to follow this argument, both in terms of what it meant for the conversation and the controversy that was going on in Antioch that led to the argument that Paul had with Peter, and then how that turns the corner in the book of Galatians from what Paul had been talking about, his own apostleship, to the controversy that was actually going on at that time. Because this incident in Antioch is over. At the time he is relating this in chapter 2 of Galatians, this incident with Peter and the others in Antioch, that's already happened. That's a done event from his point of view. But the issue in Galatia is still going on. So he's going to be using this section to transition to talking back to the Galatians situation. And so we're going to be reading along and paying close attention to how this dialogue unfolds. When Peter came to Antioch, so this is after Paul had gone back to Antioch from Jerusalem, which he writes about in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. I think this is a visit they read about in Acts 11, where he and Barnabas went to Jerusalem with a gift from Antioch to the Jerusalem church in response to revelation about the upcoming famine. And he stayed there. And apparently it was during this time when Peter was around. I don't know, maybe Acts has that out of order, I'm not sure. And then at the end of Acts 12, Paul and Barnabas go back to Antioch. And at some point, Peter shows up there too. And this would have been after, I think, Paul and Barnabas got done in Jerusalem, back to Antioch, but before they went on their mission, which we read about in Acts 13. So it was sometime in the frame of time between the end of Acts 12 and the beginning of Acts 13, apparently. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James. These are men coming from Jerusalem, apparently coming from James. We don't know who they are. We don't know what they were doing. We don't know why they came. We don't know if James really sent them. I guess he did. We don't know what the message was. But Peter has come to Antioch. He's there for a while. I don't know how long. And then some men come from Jerusalem, because James is in Jerusalem. And they cause some trouble. So before these men came from James, Peter, used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, this is play acting. The word hypocrisy here means to act. It means to put on a mask. It means to put on a character. It came from their Greek plays. So it literally meant to put on a mask and pretend to be a character. So they're acting. They know better. Peter knows better. He was the one who opened the fellowship up to Gentiles in the first place in chapter 10 of Acts. Okay, so he knows this as well as anyone, but he's acting. So the other Jews with him, the full-blooded Jews who were with him and who were in Antioch at the time, joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. Even the son of encouragement was no longer encouraging. So what is going on here? Well, we don't really know exactly what these men from James thought they were doing. But the gist of it, or whether or not James sent them there for this reason, I guess that's the real question. I don't know. But the issue that was going on here was a matter of table fellowship and a matter of keeping the lines separated between the clean Jews and the unclean Gentiles. So Paul, or Peter, these P names get me confused. Peter had known as well as anybody. In fact, he was the one who started this trend of accepting unclean, quote-unquote, unclean Gentiles into the Christian fellowship, without requiring them to become Jews first. We read about that in Acts 10. And God had given him this vision of this table or sheet being drawn down from heaven, and these unclean foods, these unclean animals, coming down on it. And Peter being told to kill these animals and eat them. And he said, no, I've never eaten unclean food. I'm not going to do that now. And the reply was, don't call unclean what God has made clean. And then after that vision was over, immediately afterwards, these men knocked on the door and asked for Peter, and it turns out these were the messengers from Cornelius' house, so Peter went there. So the whole point was that the Gentiles are no longer unclean. And the reason for that being that the restrictions that were put in place through the law of Moses are no longer binding. So therefore, Gentiles can become part of the Christian fellowship. They can become followers of the Messiah without having to become Jews first. And that was confirmed to the Jews at that moment by the Gentiles, Cornelius and his family, his household, speaking in tongues in front of them before being baptized. Now remember that speaking in tongues is a sign for unbelievers, okay? In that case, in Acts 10, the unbelievers were Peter and the other Jews who were with him, who saw these Gentiles, full-blooded Gentiles. So there's no speck of Jewish blood in them. And they were speaking in tongues as Peter and the other apostles had on the day of Pentecost. And that was a confirmation sign to Peter that these people have the Holy Spirit. God has accepted them as members of his new Messiah family. And who's Peter to argue with that? And that's what he says to the Jews of Jerusalem. And he goes back there and explains his actions. So therefore, this wall that has been built for 2,000 years at this point between Jews and non-Jews has been broken down. And Peter knows that. Okay, Barnabas knows that. Okay, these leaders who were getting involved in this in Antioch at this time, they knew that. But because of some kind of social pressure that was being put on them, they ended up deciding to go eat only with Jews again and leave the Gentiles over there at some other table. So they were building back up this wall of separation between Jews and Gentiles, which was supposed to have been torn down in the church, and which Peter and the others knew better. And they knew it had been torn down. And this again goes back to the idea of social pressure. And we've been seeing this throughout the New Testament, even during the ministry of Jesus, before the church itself actually existed as an institution, that there was intense pressure, social pressure, and we saw this particularly in the Gospel of John, that there was intense social pressure not to join this movement because Jesus was a troublemaker, he was not really the Messiah, and if you follow him, you're going to get kicked out of the synagogue. And that was a serious threat from Jew to Jew. You know, the Jews who were in control of the synagogue could threaten their members to kick them out, excommunicate them. And that was a serious threat for a number of reasons. They would lose access to the community resources, or possibly their family resources, and also they would no longer be in protection from having to participate in Roman state worship. The Jews had an exception, a legal exception. They didn't have to participate in Roman state worship. But if you were kicked out of the synagogue, now you were going to have to follow the Roman state rules because you were no longer under that legal exception. And so if you didn't, which you wouldn't if you were a Christian, you wouldn't start worshiping Zeus or Jupiter or Caesar or whatever. But now you didn't have the legal protection of being a Jew, and so now you're going to be required to do that, and you're going to have even more trouble. And this problem, as I said in the previous videos, would have been getting worse as the first century went on and as Rome and Judea came closer and closer to engaging in open warfare with each other. The hostilities and the tension would have just been ratcheting up year after year after year until finally it exploded. Now, this would have been largely after the apostles' time. Peter and Paul were both dead by the time Jerusalem fell. And I don't know about the other apostles. John survived beyond the fall of Jerusalem, but most of them probably didn't. Most of them probably died before, but we really don't know for sure. But anyway, as time went on, this pressure would have been getting more and more intense. It seems as though, as we read in the book of Acts, that the apostles managed to stay in Jerusalem for a long period of time with an uneasy truce or cessation of hostilities with the Jerusalem authorities, mainly apparently because they did continue to engage in a lot of the Jewish ritual law. James apparently did. James seems to have been pretty big on that. And so it seems as though a lot of that was due to social pressure. They still met separately. They still gathered together in their own assemblies. They still taught Jesus as the new temple and as the new Torah. So they didn't continue to view the existing temple as the proper place where God met his people. Jesus was that now. But they do seem to have done a lot to maintain an uneasy truce with the other Jews, the non-Christian Jews, mainly by continuing to observe a lot of the ritual laws. I don't know if they continued to offer sacrifices, because that would have been completely done away with Jesus' sacrifice. So I doubt they did that. But I'm sure they still kept the Sabbath. I'm sure they still kept the food laws. I'm sure they still kept the feast laws. And so there's pressure on these Jews to keep, even outside of Jerusalem, to keep doing that. And that's where a lot of this issue comes in. And then there's pressure, continuing from that, flowing out of that. There's pressure to get Gentile converts to start doing that too. And that is what is going on here in Antioch. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all. So Paul is going to confront Peter. We're going to start a new video here. And we're going to pick through the rest of chapter 2 line by line and say what Paul is, try to figure out what Paul is saying to Peter, and then try to figure out if he's talking to Peter for the whole time, or if he starts swinging it around to talk to the Galatians. I know that by Galatians 3 verse 1, he's talking to the Galatians again. So we're going to kind of go through it line by line and see if we can follow his train of thought from this flashback encounter in Antioch with Peter to the current situation ongoing in Galatia.